Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening, a big welcome. If you're a repeat listener, welcome back. Tonight's episode is going to be a continuation to Avatar Part 1. We're going to be looking at more of the pre- and post-production on the first Avatar film, as well as some of the technological achievements made while that film was in production, and a hell of a lot more. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is episode 52, Part 2 of Avatar, the history behind the film, trials and more tribulations.
Hey Paranormies, I'm Brittany.
And I'm Alexa.
And we're the hosts of They Don't Stay Dead.
We're a paranormal podcast from Australia, and we've made it our mission to share with you all the real-life ghost stories and haunted locations from our home, as well as encounters with supernatural beings and reports of unknown mysteries.
From haunted asylums and ghost ships to big cat cryptids and alien encounters, there's something for everyone. We release new episodes every Thursday, and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Be sure to check out our Instagram at They Don't Stay Dead for weekly updates. We get a little bit spooky and a lot silly. So join us for some laughs and a tale of the unknown.
Stay spooky, Paranormies.
It's now 2006, and early on into the new year, James Cameron gets to work on the script for Avatar. At the same time, he creates the culture of the Na'vi. In February, he announces his new film, Project 880, was a redeveloped idea of Avatar. He writes a script over the next couple of months, from January to about April. Dr. Paul Former, a USC linguist, was brought on board to create the Na'vi language. His job was to create the language and words. Over 1,000 words were composed by Dr. Former, with James Cameron contributing to about 30 of them. I've always been fascinated how languages were made for movies. It must be an extremely difficult job. Language itself is pretty fascinating when you think about how many languages there are around the world. And you're given the job to come up with a fictionalized language for a indigenous alien culture. It must be pretty fucking hard. Linguists must have a hard job in general. So when they're given free rein to come up with one for a film, it must put a lot of pressure on them. Just look at all the movies that have done this previously. Star Wars has several languages for all the different cultures. Star Trek and all the endless sci-fi movies. Sigourney Weaver joined the cast pretty early on. She even met University of California Jody S. Holt, professor of plant physiology. Sigourney Weaver learnt the traits of a botanist, meeting with the professor to talk about the way in which Pandora's ecosystems communicated. That's the network running through all the plants on Pandora. There's even a theory here on planet Earth. There's a lot of scientists who are starting to think that the Amazon is one giant living organism, as opposed to several million plants and trees. Could be true. Sounds like it. So things were coming together, but the road to release was a long one. During the years of 2006 to 2007, Mr. Cameron ramped up pre-production on Avatar. However, there was one big problem before the digital cameras could start rolling, and that was, what does the world of Pandora look like? James Cameron had used 3D brush renderings to flesh out his world, but this wasn't enough to capture the world that he had envisioned. To help with this problem and the design and illustration process, Cameron hired Wayne Barlow, the acclaimed fantasy illustrator and conceptual artist Jordu Shell. The job was to use traditional artistic methods such as physical sculptures and paintings to design the big blue aliens. Work begun on James Cameron's Malibu kitchen table. A lot of things get accomplished on a kitchen table. In mid-2006, James Cameron announces filming would commence early February 2007, with a release date of mid-2008. That's cutting it pretty close for a film that ambitious. I'm surprised he didn't set a later release date. The dates had been set, pre-production was ramping up, and Pandora was slowly coming to life. In August, Weta Digital, Peter Jackson's effects company that produced the stunning effects in Lord of the Rings, was brought on board to help with production, as well as James Cameron's old friend and longtime collaborator, Stan Winston. He was brought on to help with design. Production design on any film is a pretty long and complex process, so I can only imagine how hard it would have been designing an entire world with two separate and vastly different cultures. So it should come as no surprise that Avatar had a pretty lengthy production design. It took place over a few years and had two different production and art departments, one of which designed the natural world of Pandora and the other the world of the RDA. They designed the machinery, weapons and buildings. While all this was going on, James Cameron set to work on a new camera system, the reality camera system for 3D filming, along with Vince Pace. He released it to the world in September of 2006. It's pretty much the biggest difference between a standard camera system and this new 3D reality camera. The reality camera had two high-definition cameras contained in the one camera housing, giving it a much better sense of depth perception than a standard camera. This allowed feature films to be shot in stereoscopic 3D. I did see a documentary on that. I don't think the Avatar special features. If memory serves correctly, it was a pretty ordinary piece of equipment. The camera was more or less a square box with two lenses sticking out of it. It didn't look high-tech or sophisticated, it looked pretty ordinary, but it was obviously a revolutionary piece of technology. It's also known as the fusion camera. Pre-production was on track and going well. Avatar was one step closer to coming to life on the screen, and everything was going to plan. That is until it was time to take it to the studio executives, those bean-counting, suit-wearing little parasites. They hold the fate of all films in their slimy little hands, and they very rarely want to give up any money to put towards a film, especially if it doesn't have a rock-solid story. Even a filmmaker the caliber of James Cameron, who has a proven track record of success and winning several Academy Awards, had a pretty uphill battle getting Avatar produced by a big studio, which is really surprising when you think about it, especially coming off the back of a film like Titanic that won 11 Academy Awards. There still wasn't enough to convince the studio to sign over a blank check. 20th Century Fox wouldn't commit to Avatar, and it kept shifting its commitment to the film. I can only imagine how James Cameron felt about all this and how frustrated he was. And given a movie this big and expensive is a giant risk for any studio, no matter how big they are, but it is James Cameron who is making it. If it was a novice director or someone who had a couple of films under their belt, you'd probably side with the studio. But James Cameron doesn't make shit films, he makes masterpieces. So you can at least hear him out, or put up half the money, or come to some type of an agreement. It does seem like 20th Century Fox would be in stick in the muds with the budget. And I imagine he would have been even extra frustrated, given that he had spent the last couple of years developing and refining the idea of Avatar, and especially after all these design elements have gone into place, the world is taking shape, the story is done, the designs for both cultures are coming together, and now he's been hit with this giant roadblock because the studios won't get on board. The studios were concerned due to what had happened with Titanic's production, with all the delays and cost blowouts, despite the fact that Titanic and Cameron took home 11 Oscars, and it is the third highest grossing film of all time. But I guess this doesn't mean shit to studios, so the studios just being stingy. Titanic made a lot of money, it made its money back, it definitely made its production costs back many times over, not to mention the prestige it garnered 20th Century Fox. Up until then, they weren't really making a lot of big epic films, especially the ones on the scale of Titanic. Fox was more known for producing sci-fi movies and action movies like Die Hard, Star Wars, Independence Day, Aliens, Predator. So it's been a while since they had a truly big, old-style romantic epic, which you'd think any studio would have been jumping at the chance to produce Titanic, but I guess it just proves that studios only give a shit about money and the bottom line, despite the fact that Titanic made a, no pun intended, boatload of money. And as I mentioned, Titanic didn't just make money, it garnered a lot of prestige for 20th Century Fox and the suits who had their names attached to it. And there's a lot of things that happened on the set of Titanic. There were stories of sabotage on set where someone deliberately served spoilt shrimp and gave a lot of the cast and crew food poisoning. Except for James Cameron, DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, who were all vegetarians. So that plan kind of failed. Then there is the infamous story of James Cameron having a meltdown and flying back from the set of Titanic to 20th Century Fox's offices and kicking the door in of one of the executives and giving him a thorough ear bashing. And there's all those stories that allegedly surround Rupert Murdoch trying to sabotage or pull the pin on the production. He didn't want it made. And don't quote me on this, he allegedly said something along the lines of, why would anyone want to pay for a movie they already know the ending to? I guess he was wrong. There's two sides to every story, and this one's no different. The executives were concerned about production costs, blowouts and delays, unforeseen costs such as the production budget running over. So on the one hand, you can kind of see where they're coming from, but James Cameron, he was pretty reasonable dealing with the studios. He even offered to cut his fee if the film failed. He even rewrote the script several times, combining and cutting out a few different characters. He was cutting the fat even more on the script, making it tighter and more theatrical. But this still wasn't enough. James Cameron's vision was once again in limbo. He even had a traffic light installed outside of John Landau, the producer's office. The orange light was always on, meaning that nothing new had developed on the film, and it was still in a state of limbo with the tight-ass studio executives. But these are also the same people that take all the credit after a film does well and makes a lot of money. They're the ones that talk to the press and tell them how talented Jim is and how it was a great production and we just believed in this project from the start, when in reality they don't want to put a single penny up unless there's a guarantee of some money. It's around mid-2006 and the executives at Fox finally give James Cameron an update on what is happening with Avatar. And the news wasn't very good. They tell him Fox was passing on the film, and this is a quote, in no uncertain terms that they were passing on the film. So what is James Cameron to do? He starts to take Avatar to other studios, hoping someone else is interested in it. First on this long list was Disney. Jim brings then chairman of Disney, Dick Cook, a proof of concept. As things turn out, Disney was trying all the way back then to try and take over Fox. So what does Fox do? They flex their legal muscles and hit Disney with a right of first refusal. This is interesting. I didn't know that Disney was interested in buying 20th Century Fox all the way back in 2006. If you don't like Disney, there's one thing you have to admire about them, and that is their persistence. They don't go away easy. If they want something, they're pretty determined to get it. So in a way, this is the best thing to happen to Avatar, because by October of that year, Fox pulls its head out of its ass and finally comes to an agreement and commit to making Avatar. Ingenious Media had also signed on to produce, which more than likely gave Fox a bit more of a security blanket, especially a financial one. Having Ingenious Media on board meant Fox's financial responsibilities were reduced to half of the original projection of $237 million. Which shows you just how stingy these studios can be. The bean counters really do run Hollywood and control the film, music and game industries. It's all about the money. Which doesn't say a lot about Fox's backbone really, because you have a comparatively smaller production company like Ingenious Media steps up to the plate and puts the money up to make a colossal movie like Avatar, which obviously made Fox comfortable enough committing to the project. For shame. Fox should probably be ashamed letting a smaller company like Ingenious Media take the lead. Fox is a juggernaut of a film company. They've been around for a very long time. They're one of the original big film studios. Ingenious Media, on the other hand, was founded in 1998 by Patrick McKenna. It's based out of UK as an investment and advisory group. It's much, much smaller than Fox, and they only have about 80 employees. But it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Ingenious Media definitely steps up, and they are ambitious as all fuck. They've produced some massive films in the past, like Life of Pi, Baz Luhrmann's Australia, Sunshine, Hannibal Rising, Die Hard 4, Gold, Hairspray, and Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It's a pretty impressive list. Most of their titles are great films. So in retrospect, this is pretty funny. Fox passes on the film, Disney tries to take over, Fox doubles down on the film. We fast forward a decade and a bit, and Disney end up buying Fox and everything else that isn't bolted down, which is kind of funny. So in the end, Disney ends up owning the original Avatar and putting up $2 billion to produce the Avatar sequels. Guess James Cameron could say, "I told you so," after it became one of the highest grossing films of all time. Even after Ingenious Media was on board, one of the executives at Fox told James Cameron and John Landau, while shaking his head at them, and this is a quote from this uncreative prick who probably shouldn't be working in the film industry. It makes you wonder why so many unoriginal people get these positions of power at these creative film companies, because they don't seem to be very creative. And this is the quote: "I don't know if we're crazier for letting you do this, or if you're crazier for thinking you can do this. What a boring, imaginative, bean-counting little cunt." But he ate those words, and a 38 special after Avatar became one of the highest grossing films of all time. I got a feeling that James Cameron probably said something along the lines of "challenge accepted." So now the studios are on board, the script is done, and production ramps up, which brings up the lingering issue of the budget. By December of 2006, James Cameron tells the press about the plot of his ambitious project, describing it in a brief synopsis as this is a quote, "a futuristic tale set on a planet 200 years hence, an old-fashioned jungle adventure with an environmental conscience that aspires to a mythic level of storytelling." In January of the new year, in 2007, a press release for Avatar is released, describing it as, and this is a quote, "an emotional journey of redemption and revolution." James Cameron gave a brief rundown of what to expect from the story, saying, "A wounded former Marine, thrust unwillingly into an effort to settle and exploit an exotic planet rich in biodiversity, who eventually crosses over to lead the indigenous race in a battle for survival." Hints were given as to the scale of the film and what was in store for the world, aliens, the glowing flora, and culture that he created. With such an epic vision came an epic budget. It's regarded as one of the most expensive films ever made. The unadjusted for inflation figure is $237 million. That's the official figure. Titanic cost $200 million in 1997, which is one of the few pre-2000 movies to be in the most expensive movies ever made list, which is pretty impressive. He has several of the highest grossing films of all time, and he also has several of the most expensive films of all time. Most of the movies on the most expensive movies ever made list are post-2000, and this is the era of the blockbuster visual effects heavy movies that we are so used to seeing nowadays. Way of Water comes in at an unofficial figure of $350 million. There's lots of rumours that have speculated about the cost of The Way of Water, but no official figures yet. Spectre 007 cost $245 million in 2013. So in a few years, the production cost of these types of movies keeps going up, and if the trend continues, in another couple of years, these movies are probably going to cost well into the $350 million range. If we adjust the price for inflation, the original Avatar cost around $299 million, which is kind of funny because Waterworld comes in at $306 million. That was made in 1995, and that film is regarded as being a flop. I thought it was pretty interesting. It's an interesting world it created. Slight issues with the execution of the film, but it was an interesting idea, and it's one I really hope someone remakes or reboots in the future. Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides comes in at number 1 at a whopping $456 million. That is a lot of money. And Age of Ultron comes in at $417, followed closely by Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End at $392. But by far the most expensive film ever made, adjusted for inflation, is the Soviet-era War and Peace, the 1966 version. It was released in 4 parts from 1966 to 1967. It is called the most expensive movie made according to Soviet sources, so you can probably take that with a very large grain of salt. Let's say anything to compete or throw off the capitalist pig dogs in the rest of the world. Their figure put the production at $100 million back then in the 1960s. So in terms of today's money, that would cost around $700 million fucking dollars. And that is an astronomical and very eye-watering amount for a movie, which shows you the priorities of the Soviets during the 60s. The Soviets told the American press the $100 million figure. However, someone did some digging into the financial records and found that the film cost about $9 million. In today's money, that would be around the $60 to $70 million mark. But a surprising entry into the most expensive films of all time is the 1927 film Metropolis, which is often cited as costing $200 million back then to make, which is a lot of money for 1927, but unfortunately that has to be a fake number because there's no way a film back then could have cost $200 million unless you built an entire country to film in or you brought a private island to film on. It's a very exaggerated figure. Fritz Lang's film is often reported as costing $200 million at the value of modern money, but in reality it cost $1.2 to $1.3 million at time of production back in 1927. In today's figures, that's around $21 million. Before the official figure, Avatar is said to have cost anywhere between $280 and $310 million, which is not unreasonable given that it was the first film of its kind. It's a new generation of uber big budget films that push motion capture and visual effects technology to the next level. According to a studio rep, it cost $237 plus $150 marketing. End of story. It's not hard to see the themes that run through Avatar or the inspirations that inspired it. Its themes are pretty clear and defined, and so are the inspirations. Whenever you talk to someone about Avatar, there's always a comparison to other films. Avatar does have strong themes and uses familiar story arcs that we have seen and have been done several times before. But I will always argue that no one has ever taken those themes or arcs to this kind of level. Name me one other character like Jake Sully, who goes from a wheelchair-bound former Marine, who finds himself on another planet working for a company, taking over his dead twin brother's avatar, who goes from a human to a 9-foot-tall blue alien. It hasn't been done. No character has had that journey from human to alien, finally becoming permanently alien, and leading an indigenous culture to victory over a technologically superior alien force. Jake Sully has a pretty extreme story arc. There aren't too many sci-fi films where the central characters go on such an extreme journey and end up in such a foreign landscape. Obviously Luke Skywalker has a pretty extreme journey, but a lot of sci-fi movies that are made today lack characterization and focus too much on the visual effects side of things. He is a man who turns into an alien, then has a family with an alien woman on another planet, falling for her and the culture she's a part of and the world she lives in. Name me one other character that has that type of arc. And speaking of inspirations, I always hear it's Dances with Wolves in space, or it's Pocahontas in space, or it's Fern Gully in space. So what inspirations did James Cameron have while writing Avatar? It's time to hear from the horse's mouth, rather than a bunch of film critic fuckboys who think they know what they're talking about. Avatar at its core is a big sci-fi action adventure with a very strong focus on indigenous cultures, imperialism, ecology, environmentalism, corporate greed, fitting in culturally, and a good old-fashioned love story. James Cameron cites his biggest inspirations as, and this is the quote, "Every single science fiction book I read as a kid, specifically the John Carter series." Underrated film, by the way. Film cops a lot of shit. It definitely went outside the box. It did its own thing. It wasn't a huge success, unfortunately. I was looking forward to John Carter sequels, but you don't get everything you want. I can definitely see how John Carter inspired Avatar. He wanted to update the style of Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. John Carter, he's a dude from Earth who ends up in a foreign world, coexisting with aliens and helping them in their fight against a tyrannical empire, or something along those lines. James Cameron has commented on the themes of Avatar, saying that they share a common thread with other films such as Princess Mononoke. That film specifically served as inspiration for Pandora's ecosystem. Other inspirations were the Emerald Forest, At Play in the Fields of the Lord, and of course, Dances with Wolves. All those stories share one common thread. and that is the thread of conflict between civilizations and cultures. Dances with Wolves. Kevin Costner's character, Lieutenant Dunbar, is a soldier in the US Army who ends up living with the Lakota Indians and falling in love with Stands with a Fist, despite the military he represents being at war with Lakota. Jake is very similar to Dunbar. They're both grizzled ex-vets who end up siding with the culture their militaries are fighting against and falling in love with an indigenous woman and or alien. So this is a bit of trivia, which I didn't know prior to researching this. After Avatar was released, in 2012, James Cameron has a 45-page legal declaration drafted describing in detail the themes, inspirations, historical events, i.e. the obvious historical events that bear similarity to the events in Avatar, and that is colonization of the Americas, storylines and personal experiences that connected to Avatar. This is a quote from him. Describe in great detail the genesis of the ideas, themes, storylines, and images that came to be Avatar. This also included his previous films, such as his very first 12-minute short film back in 1978, Exon Genesis. The film in particular serves as the basis of a lot of the visual designs and ideas of Avatar. There are similar recurring themes in all of James Cameron's films. This is a quote. Concepts of a world mind, intelligence within nature, the idea of projecting force or consciousness using an avatar, colonization of alien planets, greedy corporate interests backed up by military force, the story of a seemingly weaker group prevailing over a technologically superior force, and the good scientist were all established and recurrent themes. Aliens in particular is very similar thematically. It has greedy corporations, an advanced military going up against a more primitive alien force. The ship and world design is very similar to that of Avatar. The USCM Marines and the RDA Marines, they can nearly be from the same world and place. If you dropped a USCM Marine into the jungles of Pandora, that would fit right in. The same if you dropped a RDA Marine into the world of aliens, they wouldn't seem too out of place. They're very similar in what they wear, weapon design, ship design, even the camouflage has some similarities, albeit Aliens was made 30-something years ago. Especially the dropships from Aliens and the Dragon gunship, the Scorpion fighters, the power loader, and the amp suit, they all bear striking similarities. If you had a power loader walking around the amp suit bay, it wouldn't look out of place. And then there's the themes of corporations wanting to exploit aliens to their advantage. Burke and Selfridge are pretty much the same. They could be from the same corporate office for all we know. And the biggest differences is Burke is a sneaky, sabotaging little cunt, where Selfridge is just a greedy one. And speaking of Selfridge, I wanted a bit more backstory to him and the corporate world of Avatar. How do they find the unobtainium? Why do they need it or need so much of it? These themes make up the backbone of both films, Aliens and Avatar. And there's also parallels in the Abyss with the water tentacle. There's another example of an Avatar, and this is a quote from James Cameron about the Abyss. It takes on the appearance of an alien life form in order to bridge the cultural gap and build trust. Cameron also drew inspiration from some of his favourite films, one of which being 2001: A Space Odyssey. One of the obvious themes of that film is human evolution after contact with extraterrestrial life forms. Another influence was Lawrence of Arabia. While on the surface, Lawrence of Arabia doesn't appear to be an obvious choice of influence, but there are a lot of similarities. And I like this quote by James Cameron about Lawrence of Arabia. An outsider encounters and immerses into a foreign culture and then ultimately joins that group to fight other outsiders, which is more or less the whole backbone of Avatar and Jake's journey. And much like Lawrence of Arabia, Jake is a bit of a rebel. He definitely goes against the grain. He goes against his tribe and takes up with another, even though it does cause quite a bit of conflict with his original tribe. But the one question I really want to know is, where did the concept of an avatar come from? One of the inspirations behind the synthetic avatar lifeforms is found in the Imagicon, a short story by George Henry Schmidt and Arthur C. Clarke. and the city and the stars. The word avatar came from James Cameron reading cyberpunk novels by William Gibson, specifically William Gibson's Neuromancer, and I can kind of see why, and Bruce Sterling's Islands in the Net. Other inspirations were Ghost in a Shell, especially separating personalities into other bodies. I'm not too familiar with Ghost in a Shell. I've been meaning to watch that movie for fucking years, but have never got around to it. I know it's a long-standing anime series, which doesn't really interest me. But one theme that separates itself from a majority of sci-fi films is the world mind, aka the Pandora neural network, the interconnected network known as AWA. The network I find very interesting. As I mentioned before, some scientists do think there might be some type of network between plants and trees in the Amazon. And you don't see this concept much in movies, especially sci-fi movies. It's considered too hippie and new agey, but it fits into the world of Avatar and gives it this unique, for lack of a better word, it does give it a hippie-ish spiritual aspect to it that a lot of sci-fi movies don't really go into. It's interesting, and it's another unique trait of Avatar. Sci-fi novels, on the other hand, have gone into the world of the world mind more so than films. Stanislav Lem's Solaris is the origin of the world mind concept. James Cameron has also said he has drawn inspiration from films involving indigenous cultures and their interaction with other cultures, i.e. more technologically advanced cultures. The most obvious being Dances with Wolves, The Mission, The Man Who Would Be King, The Emerald Forest, and Fern Gully. And I think these themes and concepts are quite dominant in Avatar, but it's done in a very unique and gigantic way, where like a story like Fern Gully was kind of this microcosm of bigger things happening in the world, where Avatar has taken a similar concept and applied it to an entire planet. And obviously there's these strong environmental themes running through Avatar. The Jungle Book was also a source of inspiration. The culture or species clash. In Avatar, it's the clash between aliens and aliens, essentially. Tech versus instinct. Alien tribe versus alien tribe. Or primitive alien tribe versus technologically superior alien tribe. The world mind is a concept that Cameron has used before. The aliens in the abyss are connected to the water and can manipulate it through thought. The aliens in Aliens have that hive mind mentality. The queen alien is a microcosm of Awa. She can send out those signals to the warrior aliens. And that was the genius of Aliens, is that he expanded the alien universe and gave it this extra layer. He came up with that hive mind concept and the whole ecosystem that the queen creates, the tunnels and the slime and the eggs. And one of the most obvious and main themes of Avatar is the clash of primitive indigenous cultures versus the technologically advanced greedy culture who thinks that the indigenous culture's beliefs are complete bullshit and standing in the way of their profits. This theme isn't just reserved for stories and movies. This happens in everyday life. It's happened all throughout history with colonization all around the world. You look at the conflict when you have indigenous tribes in the Amazon, when they meet anthropologists for the first time. Things can get a little hairy. You look at European colonization all over the world. Those scars still run very deep today. Not to get too woke, but we're still living with the effects of colonization on indigenous populations. People get outraged by the treatment of indigenous cultures in the movies. In Avatar, the scene that outrages the audience most is the attack on the home tree. In Avatar, The Way of Water, if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, the whale scenes. But in real life, this still happens on a daily basis and people don't really seem to give a shit about it. We don't quite seem to learn the lesson that there might be a better way to live. Modern society is kind of at odds with this better way to live with nature. It kind of seems that you have to be either one side or the other. And obviously there's a lot of positive things about modern society and about modern living, but there's also a lot of negative. Social media, screen time, isolation, loss of communication skills, these are all byproducts of over-reliance on technology, specifically social media and communications technology. So maybe we all need to put our phones in a drawer and go on a long hike for a couple of days and readjust, reset the mind. Or maybe I'm just talking complete shit. But there does seem to be a disconnect with modern society and healthier ways to live. Obviously, our food chain, our food supplies are being poisoned by greedy corporate entities. There's always a cheaper way to do things, add preservatives, the over-reliance on sugar, fast food. These aren't the best parts of modern life. Yes, they're convenient, but the payoff is you're trading your health for convenience. Where if you're out hunting all day, you're getting a workout and you're also earning your dinner. But that's a bigger topic for another day. In Aliens, this is made clear when Burke tries to have humans infected with alien embryos so he can take them back to his corporate masters and use them for whatever nefarious means. In other words, he's making money out of using the alien as a weapon. If we look back at our own culture over thousands of years, and if you're into ancient aliens, you've probably heard of all the stories of the Anunnaki, a highly advanced alien culture interacting with primitive modern humans. The story goes they used genetically modified humans to mine gold because they needed it. They came here looking to exploit resources and the indigenous primitive apes they found there. A similar thing is seen in cargo cults, especially in World War II, when the Americans were in the Pacific Islands. A lot of the more primitive indigenous cultures thought the Americans arriving in their shiny metal birds were gifts from the gods, and when the Americans left, they took all their supplies, their canned food, and all their resources with them. The indigenous people started to make effigies of planes out of wood and burning them in an attempt to get the Americans to come back. And when you think about it, the world is a giant, fascinating and terrifying place that has been made that little bit smaller with advances in technology and the internet. Everyone is linked now. We know what's happening on the other side of the world within an hour of something happening, probably even quicker than that. But there are still very primitive indigenous tribes out there around the world that haven't been found yet. Every few years, a new tribe pops up in South America. World War II was 75 years ago, yet there were indigenous people who had never seen a plane before. Granted, there's probably a lot of people around the world that hadn't seen planes. Planes were relatively new at that time. But it does show that even in the modern world, interactions by highly advanced cultures and primitive cultures still happen. So to dig a little deeper into the meaning of the word avatar, most of us have a pretty good idea of what it means due to the first film. But during an interview with Time magazine back in 2007, James Cameron was asked what Avatar meant, and his reply was, "It's an incarnation of one of the Hindu gods taking a flesh form. In this film, what that means is that the human technology in the future is capable of injecting a human's intelligence into a remotely located body, a biological body." This is an interesting term. The idea of an avatar is very cool. That's one part I loved about the film, and that was also a little harder to grasp at how it was possible, is how you could have a biological life form and have it linked to a human being's mind. I have no doubt that in the future human beings will probably have their own version of doing this, whether this be through a remote piloted robot or a biomechanical creature. There's lots of theories about aliens being avatars or biomechanical droids that are either controlled or they get sent to the other side of the universe to explore or keep an eye on planets that might be still developing, making sure we don't nuke ourselves. That was probably the most interesting part of the film for me, was going in that link chamber and then you wake up in the body of a 9-foot tall blue alien. This will probably be done in the future. So if you take that concept and look at it at a different angle, think of what could be done in the medical fields if you could have a pilot or a doctor link their consciousness to a microscopic robot and go inside someone's body and perform surgery. Think of what could be possible to take like a nanomite or some type of very tiny surgical robot device thing, and you can have the doctor operate it remotely. Think of what could be achieved. Same goes for astronauts. If you could pilot robots or biomechanical creatures or droids, and you can have them operating in space. On the one hand, it'd be a lot safer for people, but it also allows astronauts to stay relatively safe or stay earthbound, which wouldn't be much fun if you're an astronaut, I suppose. So if you had an astronaut in space, and you had to do work on the outside of the ship. It's dangerous, it's hazardous, and it takes a lot of effort. Send the remote-controlled robot out there with the astronaut controlling it from the safety of the ship. You could potentially build on the moon or other planets or asteroids. Can't wait for asteroid mining. I'll definitely be a first investor in that field. If technology gets to a point where that's possible, basically anything will be possible. You think of it in search and rescue, then there's the whole moral conundrum of using it for the military, coming up with kill bots pretty much that doesn't matter if they get shot, they can keep going, their pilots are safe in an air-conditioned room somewhere. If humans or another more advanced extraterrestrial civilization has that type of technology to connect their mind to a physical body and remote control it, just imagine what you could do. It would make space exploration much easier. You wouldn't have to risk leaving home to make a trip to another planet. But I'm rambling. So if you look at Avatar up on the dictionary on Google, this is the meaning behind it. In Hinduism, it means a manifestation of a deity or a released soul in bodily form on earth, an incarnate divine teacher. An icon or figure representing a particular person in a video game, internet forum, etc. conversation is depicted in a balloon over the avatar's head. So there you go. So now we know the meaning, themes and inspirations behind Avatar. So let's have a look at the production side of Avatar, the artistic design and filming side of it. I've always wondered how James Cameron came up with the design of the Na'vi. Why are they blue and 9 foot tall? I mean, I do like blue. It's my favourite colour. I would have made them blue as well. But why not green? Why not yellow? Probably would have stayed away from grey, and now that I think about it, probably green, because green and grey get associated with aliens all the time. Little green men. The tall blue being idea comes from James Cameron's mother. She had a dream many, many years ago involving giant blue people, well before he had the idea for the story. And this is not the first dream to give James Cameron ideas for a film. The design for the original Terminator came from a dream he had while he was in Rome. James Cameron's mother's dream was about a 12-foot tall blue woman. And this image was a very strong one, and it's one that stayed with Mr. Cameron for quite a long time. This is a quote from James Cameron. It was kind of a cool image. He is also quoted as saying that he likes the colour blue. It's a good colour. I agree, my favourite colour is blue. It's very versatile. It comes in many shades and variations. Dark blue is also said to be a peaceful colour. Maybe there's a bit of psychology behind that. If you have a race of blue aliens, maybe they appear more peaceful and the audience is more likely to favour them over the aggressive human characters dressed mostly in green. Blue also suits the Na'vi way of life, living in harmony with nature, so maybe that does play a part in it. Going back to talking about ancient Hindu gods, there's a bit more significance to the colour than it just looking good. This is a quote from James Cameron. There's a connection to the Hindu deities, which I like conceptually. The majority of Hindu deities were blue. In the Bhagavad Gita, there are several deities depicted with blue skin. Deities such as Shiva, Rama, Krishna, Vishnu are a few that are blue-skinned. So maybe there actually are blue-skinned aliens out there in the cosmos somewhere that will one day come and visit us. He also had beautiful tall blue aliens in the first script he wrote back in 1976 to 1977. And that was most likely his short 12-minute film, Exon Genesis. The Na'vi are based on these tall blue aliens. So appearance and design played a pretty vital role in the final designs of the Na'vi, especially Neytiri's design. And appearances were very important because it lended credibility to the believability of the story, and in particular Jake and Neytiri's less than normal love story. If the designs weren't right, the story was going to be harder to take seriously. There are similarities with the love story in Titanic. This is a quote from Mr. Cameron. Both couples come from radically different cultures that are contemptuous of their relationships and are forced to choose sides between the competing communities. He has also said Neytiri is much like Pocahontas and Jake is the white outsider who falls for the chief's daughter. She in turn becomes his guide to their way of life and to the tribe and the connection to nature and Awa. What I didn't know is that James Cameron thought it was important to make the love story as believable as possible. I didn't know so much time and effort went into the love story side of Avatar. In order to do this meant making Neytiri as physically attractive as possible. Neytiri's appearance was developed by considering the male crew artists' reaction to her designs. In the Auckland Sky Needle thing, I can't remember what it's called, there's a Weta workshop on the bottom floor. There's a giant full-sized statue of Neytiri. And you don't realise how big they are until you actually stand next to them. The statue was fucking enormous. It was over 9 feet tall, and a human looks tiny in comparison. Getting off topic a little bit, but this will have a point. The love story in Avatar is different to a majority of other films. A human falls in love with an alien, essentially, and they end up getting married and having a family. One of the scenes that highlights this in particular was the scene when Neytiri saves Jake after the fight with Quach at the shack, where he's disconnected from his avatar. And she picks him up, puts the mask on him and touches his face, then brings him to Awa. It is funny they did consult the male crew about the designs of Neytiri and if they found her attractive or not, because I suppose if they didn't find her attractive, then the rest of the audience probably wasn't going to either. If they made her too weird looking or too artificial, I suppose she probably has to retain some type of connection with the female form. She has to look somewhat womanish. The only difference is she's blue, 9 foot tall, and has a tail. But they have to keep that feminine beauty in order to pull off a love story, I'm guessing, because otherwise, why would Jake? Jake, obviously being a human, probably isn't attracted to aliens. So if she didn't look somewhat human, I guess the whole basis of the love story just falls apart.
Sharks of the corn? Virus shark? Cocaine shark? Sharktopus? Yeah, those are all real movies. Join me, Steve Coates, as each week I take a comedic look at the bizarre world of sharksploitation cinema on Bucket of Chum, the Shark Movie Podcast.
If we look around planet Earth, we can see many diverse ecosystems, some of which provide inspiration for Pandora's environment. The Huangshan Mountains of China were the inspiration for the Hallelujah Mountains, and Zhangjiu National Forest. Probably better off Googling them rather than me trying to explain them. They're pretty impressive, especially the Huangshan Mountains. You can really see the inspiration for the floating mountains. Some other inspirations were the karst limestone formations in China, the Noble Bordeaux oil rig, which was measured, photographed, and then recreated in CGI, and served as the basis for the mining operations on Pandora. Cameron said that he wanted to make, this is a quote from him, something that has this spoonful of sugar of all the action and adventure and all that, but also have a conscience that maybe in the enjoying of it makes you think a little bit about the way we interact with nature and your fellow man. The Navi represent something that is our higher selves, or our aspirational selves, what we would like to think we are, and that even though there are good humans within the film, the humans represent what we know to be the parts of ourselves that are trashing our world and maybe condemning ourselves to a grim future. I think he's spot on the money with that one. Whether you believe in climate change or not, I don't think anyone can really deny at this point that humans have had a pretty big impact on the planet, and it's not always a good one. Speaking of messages and metaphors, none speak more clearly than the home tree attack. There was a very distinct political voice in Avatar. You don't need to be a scholar to see the obvious metaphors for the war on nature, greed, colonialization, unchecked corporations, etc. Avatar also has a lot to say about modern/mechanized warfare and how it is all too easy to detach oneself from firing a missile or squeezing a trigger and not seeing the result of said action. This is true of modern warfare back on planet Earth and the industrialized killing in World War I, when you had waves of human beings being ordered by the blowing of a whistle to run up over the top of the trenches and charge machine gun nests. Thousands of men were just needlessly cut down by machine gun fire for really no other purpose than following orders. Nothing was gained in these machine gun charges. It was just a pointless waste of human life. And speaking of detachment, the machine gunners on the other side of the trenches, who were firing at rows and rows of young men running at them, were probably pretty detached. They probably couldn't see the faces of who they were firing at. There would have been a lot of smoke and a lot of fog and haze on those battlefields. All they probably saw were blurs and shapes of humans running towards them. Artillery strikes are the same thing. You never really see what you're hitting. The crews don't see what they hit, and they're very detached from the process of killing. They load a shell, fire it in the direction of the coordinates, and hope they hit their targets and not their own men. Detachment is especially true for vehicles in combat. Planes and jets fly over a battlefield, dropping bombs and strafing a target. Pilots would very rarely see any of the people or targets they're shooting at, unless they're flying directly over the top of them, and even then they're too small to make out. Bomber crews flying over, dropping a bomb or firing a missile before it was hit are already a mile away from the target before it hits the ground. This is a fact that Cameron was well aware of. He has also acknowledged how Avatar does criticise the US actions in the Iraq War, and how impersonal mechanised warfare has become. I get what he's saying. It's a controversial and very complex war, whether you agree with it or not. A lot more went on behind the scenes than a lot of people realise. It wasn't an easy situation. It obviously proved to be a harder one to get out of. And taking this back to Avatar, there was no clearer example of this than the attack on the home tree. Up until this point, the audience is pretty split. Some are siding with the RDA and the humans, bearing in mind not all the humans in the film are bad guys. Trudy worked for the RDA and she ends up on the side of the Na'vi. She sees the brutality of the humans and the lengths they're willing to go to. The Colonel and his crew are a bunch of pricks pretty much, but they're very good bad guys. I do like the Colonel. Stephen Lang is an incredible actor. His performance turns Quaritch into one of the most realistic and intimidating characters that has been put on screen in a while, especially in a sci-fi movie. Some sci-fi characters tend to be a little corny and a little over the top sometimes, where I think he is definitely a realistic and grounded character. He has a mission and he's going to do whatever it takes to get that mission accomplished. He doesn't care who's standing in his way or who he has to kill to do it. Avatar is also one of the few sci-fi films to show humans as the technologically superior alien invaders. This isn't done very much in films. I can't think of any other film where the humans are more technologically advanced, except for some of the races in Star Wars and Star Trek, which also shows you how formulaic and generic Hollywood is when it comes to sci-fi movies, and how boring and unoriginal some of them have become. And when you look at a lot of those aliens invade, two tribes go to war kind of stories, the plots are usually pretty similar. The formula to the alien invasion film has stuck, and this might be by design to force the control and information of UAPs and alien cover-ups. Maybe the government is subliminally telling us through the medium of film that this is what we're supposed to think. They want us scared of extraterrestrials because deep down they know the truth. And they're using Hollywood to get this message out there. It's just a thought. Sci-fi movies have become very formulaic and very unoriginal. There is a very distinct trait with the alien invasion movie, and that trait is stuck. Aliens from outer space always want to invade Earth for some reason, or they want some resource. Maybe the government is really using Hollywood to control the information of unidentified flying objects and UAPs and alien cover-ups. The home tree scene definitely gets the shock and awe side of modern warfare across. The mindless destruction of the tree to get to the shiny shit in the ground is one of the most emotional and disturbing parts of the movie. The haunting soundtrack and images are definitely disturbing and get the point of modern warfare across pretty accurately. And if it wasn't for the fact that the people are 9 foot tall and blue, and you saw that on the news, you'd swear that was a war zone in some country far, far away. And it also shows the ruthlessness of the RDA and how unempathetic and callous the way the Colonel and the other pilots go about their job in following orders. Which to a degree, they are following orders, but it also shows you the detachment in the orders and the consequences of firing missiles into a indigenous population. But this does come back to bite the humans later on in the film. In the finale, the humans aren't so tough when they have to go face to face with the Na'vi. The charge in the forest, the Banshee attack, and the attack in the Hallelujah Mountains. The RDA, for all their technology and firepower, aren't very tough when the size difference of the Na'vi comes into play. Cameron has some quotes on modern and mechanized warfare and some of the themes in the film. This is a quote by him. We don't know what it feels like for them to land on our home soil, not in America. He also has some views on the state of modern warfare. I think it's very patriotic to question a system that needs to be corralled. The film is definitely not anti-American. So there has also been comparisons with the home tree attack and 9/11. This is a quote. Surprised at how much it did look like September 11. So as we've seen, there are many themes running throughout Avatar. Some are more obvious than others. It has been inspired by a broad range of films, books, and historical events. However, Avatar definitely does its own thing. It is original, colourful. It's an enjoyable and engaging movie that holds its own without the novelty of 3D. It is one of my favourite films. It's big, bold, and beautiful in its scale and scope. Now that The Way of Water has just reached $2 billion at the box office, let's hope there will be even more films in the future, and we will get to return to Pandora once again. This brings up the production and filming side of Avatar. Filming Avatar was one of the most interesting parts of the very long production of Avatar. Shooting began in 2007. The filming process used a hybrid of live-action shots and CG characters with live environments. This is a quote. Ideally, at the end of the day, the audience has no idea which they are looking at. And that's pretty true, because you could be forgiven for thinking Pandora was shot in a jungle in the Amazon or Southeast Asia somewhere. Cameron said the live-action scenes were filmed with the 3D fusion camera system mentioned before. But surprisingly, the film wasn't all digital. Half was live action and the other half was CGI, with a mix of old-fashioned miniatures which were used throughout the production, which I wouldn't have even thought about. I thought the days of miniatures in movies were long gone. 60% of the film had CG elements and 40% of it was live action. Before shooting began, James Cameron had worked on some of the principal scenes for about 4 months. It is interesting because it's much different from the standard way of doing things, and obviously this is James Cameron, so he's got to raise the bar. So I'm not surprised that there was a completely different system for making this film. So this caused a bit of conflict with James Cameron, because in January of 2007, Fox had announced the 3D filming would be in 24 frames per second. Cameron insisted that a higher frame rate be used for 3D to cut down on the strobing effect. Which is when I first saw it, there was a noticeable shine in some scenes, mainly in the RDA headquarters and with the people on base when there was a lot of metal or screens giving off light. I think back then it was the real D 3D, now it's high frame rate 3D. Not to contradict Cameron, but I didn't think the 3D was as good in The Way of Water. It was less noticeable, but it was a lot smoother than the first Avatar. But I just found the first film was a lot more immersive and the 3D was a lot more noticeable. The first Hobbit used a high frame rate 3D and it looked fucking terrible. It looked like the film had been sped up. And being the first time I had seen it, it moved a lot different to a standard film. And I didn't think the 3D was noticeable at all in those films. Despite the many years of development and getting the studio to produce it, the filming stage of Avatar was by far the shortest part of the production, lasting a grand total of about 31 days. Motion capture was shot in the Hughes aircraft stage in Playa Vista, Los Angeles, and there was another 31 days in Stone Street Studios in Wellington, New Zealand for some of the live action photography, which took place in October of 2007. This doesn't include reshoots, delays, etc. That's not too bad, considering it had taken decades just to get to this point. So just over 2 months of filming isn't bad. There were also rehearsals in the jungles of Hawaii, and character-specific training like horse riding, hand-to-hand combat, shooting guns, and handling them, as well as archery and dialect and Na'vi language training. If I had to guess, I'd say the new camera system Cameron made had a bit to do with cutting down on the production time. The virtual camera system is a new way to detect motion capture, and now you can see what a scene will look like with all digital surroundings and characters added already in it. Scenes can be rearranged and fixed on the spot, as opposed to getting to the editing and finding out that you need to reshoot something. This is a quote from Cameron. "It's like a big, powerful game engine. If I want to fly through space or change my perspective, I can. I can turn the whole scene into a living miniature and go through it on a 50-to-1 scale." And that's an incredibly efficient way of doing things. I suppose long gone are the days of shooting something and hoping that it turns out and hoping it can be fixed in post-production without too many costly reshoots. Maybe Lucasfilm should adopt a similar practice. Cameron said that this did not diminish the value or importance of acting. On the contrary, because there is a need for repeated camera and lighting setups, costume fittings and makeup touches, scenes do not need to be interpreted repeatedly. And that is a key point. You can just keep filming rather than having to stop every time there's a cut or every time a feather falls off a costume. It's a much more efficient way to do things. Virtual environments and backgrounds also mean you don't have to set a date and time to build sets, props, if they're kept to a minimum during the production. And Cameron has said it is a form of pure creation where you want to move a tree or a mountain or the sky or change the time of day, you have complete control over the elements. Yeah, so no more waiting for perfect lighting or a cloudy day. You can manipulate it all with the click of a button, more or less. This new method of movie making attracted a few of the biggest directors on Earth to come and visit the set. Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson visited and tested out the new technology. Steven Spielberg came back with George Lucas to watch James Cameron direct a scene using the new system. And talk about no pressure. Just imagine having a big scene that day to shoot and having Steven Spielberg and George Lucas drop by. Spielberg said, "I think of it as digital makeup, not augmented animation. Motion capture brings a director back to the kind of intimacy that actors and directors only know when they're working in live theatre." Interesting. And he's obviously gone on to make a couple of films that were pretty reliant on motion capture. Ready Player One, Tintin. In order to see the live action and CGI components working together, you need to use a system combined with the 3D Fusion camera and the virtual camera system, which became known in the industry as the Simucam. Simucam works by filming the live action and the CGI or whatever images being captured via the virtual camera are placed over the top of the live action images, which are then transferred by magic in augmented reality onto a monitor. James Cameron then can tell the actors how to perform to match what he has seen on the monitor. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. Don't quite quote me on that. It was very hard to try and translate what some of that meant. After the filming side of production was done, it was time for the fun stuff to begin. 1,000 people worked on the film. Imagine the army of digital artists and effects people, sound, 3D rendering, and all that needed. And that's after James Cameron had been waiting since 1990 for the technology to catch up to his vision. Digital lighting was also another huge element, and so were the amount of digital effects artists. Peter Jackson's Weta Digital handled most of the visual effects with an army of 900 people. The other issue faced from the masses of effects was storage capacity and hard drive space. I've had a lot of my own issues with storage space. On the computer I record in, I've only got about 10 gigs if I cleared everything, which I had to clear all the old episodes off this, and I got about 10.5 gigs. Otherwise, I'm left to work with about 3 or 4, and the space is always being filled up on the computer. It's fucking annoying, but oh well, what can you do? I can only imagine how much hard drive space was needed for a film as effects heavy as Avatar. The better the effects and technology are, the more storage is needed. And this is probably doubly true for The Way of Water, given the advancements in technology in between the two films. All this data needed to be stored and catalogued in a very clear way, so anyone who needed it could access it. And here lies the problem. Due to the production and post-production happening at opposite ends of the planet, in 2 different countries and time zones, a special cloud program had to be created. This job fell to Microsoft, who specially created a cloud computing and a digital asset management system named Gear, just for the production of Avatar. More crews in different locations could work and coordinate all the digital processing without wasting time. But now comes the rendering and the rendering of 3D frames. This took a while, a very long while. There's 24 frames per second. Every one frame took 24 hours of rendering, giving a total of 5,565,160,000 hours to finish. Now, it's a fucking long time. All that processing and rendering took up a lot of storage space, but it took an even greater amount of processing power to complete before the end of the millennium. To accomplish this, Weta used a 10,000 square foot server farm filled with 4,000 Hewlett-Packard servers outfitted with 35,000 processor cores with 104 terabyte of RAM and 3 petabytes of network storage. I don't even know what a petabyte is. Sounds like a lot. There's also a lot of programs you probably never heard of. In other words, the processing was pretty intense and it needed supercomputers to get the job done. The supercomputers were so powerful for the production of Avatar, they come in at 193 and 197 out of the world's top 500 supercomputers. Now that is pretty impressive. That's on top of all the new paint, texture and effects programs made for Avatar. The Navi and the virtual world of Pandora took up over a petabyte of storage. And I don't think a lot of people think about that when it comes to movies. I think that's more of a game and computer issue. But when you think about all the special effects used in all these blockbuster movies that are made these days, there would have to be a lot of storage to hold and process it all. Next time you watch a Marvel movie, when there's a scene that is 75% computer generated, stop and think how much time did that one scene actually take. But Weta couldn't do it all by themselves. In order to make the release deadline, ILM was brought on board with Weta. Their job was to help finish the battle scenes and vehicles. During this process, they came up with a new method of creating digital explosions. And I noticed that first time I watched the film, the explosions looked very realistic. They looked like something was actually blown up as opposed to a CGI explosion, which most of the time did look pretty fake. And that is despite the fact that nothing actually blows up on screen, due to everything else in the scene being completely digital. When everything was said and done, after all the rendering, effects and processing was complete, and the film was finally finished and ready for its release, after decades of waiting and all the 3D was done, every minute of completed footage took up 17.28 gigs of storage. Wow.
G'day. Don't skip. Let me interrupt the podcast that you're currently listening to with some blatant self-promotion. What do you get when you mix two Aussie mates, a splash of booze, well, more than a splash, and some microphones? You get Cheers Big Ears, hosted by myself, the Chad, and my mate, Matt, and sometimes, but more often than not now, my missus, Bobby. It's a podcast of adult beverages and not-so-adult conversation. It's not serious, far from it. Well, except for that one episode, but that was just that one. We're available wherever you get your podcast fix. Cheers, Big Ears.
So that concludes our look at the production of Avatar, and this brings us to the review of Avatar: The Way of Water. So I saw it the first weekend it came out. My first impressions, it was a great film, by any standard, but I do have some questions. First up, the movie is epically long. It's 3 hours and 10 minutes, which on the surface does seem long, and if it was any other movie, it would have been excessively long. But in reality, it was very well paced. It could have been 4 to 5 hours, and I still would have been sitting there on the edge of my seat watching it intently. The editing is so tight in this film that there isn't any dead space, or really any scenes that could have been cut down shorter than they already were. Every scene seems vital. Every character seems like it has a purpose. There's nothing that seems out of place or gratuitous for any reason. Nothing seems like it was deliberately drawn out just to get more out of a scene or to extend the running time. And some movies you watch just drag on and on and on, and they seem like the editor was asleep at the wheel the whole time. I've seen 80 and 90-minute movies where you get half an hour or 40 minutes into them and they are so fucking boring. You would think that an hour has gone by and there could only possibly be another 10, maybe 20 minutes of the film remaining. But in reality, you're only 25, 30 minutes into it. I hate those movies. It always makes me wonder how that idea even got off the ground. If that was the final product, the director, writer, and editor should probably go back to film school. Speaking of running time, I got a feeling there was a lot cut out of it, and there will be an extended cut or a director's cut in the future. Bring on a 5-hour, 5.5 hour long Avatar 2. I feel like there was a lot cut out of it, and hopefully they put it back into it to flesh out the story. And that's what I mean when I say I've got a lot of questions. There's a lot of new characters and locations. Some of them are only briefly mentioned before they disappear from the story altogether. And I wanted a little bit more explanation to who or what they were. It goes without saying that The Way of Water is as visually stunning as you'd expect. There are some very intense action sequences, combined with some of the most stunning imagery I've ever seen in a film. There was a lot of care and attention to detail. It had tons of action, it had humour, and it was pretty emotional. And like the first Avatar, the message of the film is pretty clear. It's all about family and the lengths that the Sully family will go to protect one another, even if that means incurring the wrath of an old enemy. The first 10 minutes or so, the audience is dropped right back into the jungles of Pandora. All the old familiar places from 13 years ago are back. The feeling of wonder and awe comes rushing back the same way it did the first time you saw Pandora in 3D. But that was one big problem I found, is that the 3D sucked bad. The 3D in the first one, in my opinion, was much better. And this goes back to the water drop scene, the floating mountains, all the floating and bioluminescent things in the forest. Avatar 2, maybe one or two scenes really stood out, and the 3D didn't feel like it was a part of the world like the first one. It seemed like every scene in the first film really stood out and was in your face. You had vines and spears and arrows and guns and plants all coming out of the screen, making this unique alien environment come to life. I didn't feel like it was necessary in The Way of Water, unlike the first film, which the 3D felt like it was part of the world and the landscape. The 3D in The Way of Water felt, and I hate to say this, it felt a little lazy, and it didn't really bring anything unique to the film. I even took my glasses off a few times during the film to check that I was still watching a 3D movie. Sometimes you couldn't really tell, which is annoying because it was pretty expensive seeing it in 3D. There's a surcharge on 3D films, and with inflation and cost of living, it was a hell of a lot more expensive than the first Avatar. I'm not speaking for every format and way Avatar The Way of Water was shown in 3D. I'm just speaking of my own personal experience in my local theatre. The 3D wasn't very good, and that's probably down to my local theatre and the quality of the 3D projection, not so much the quality of the 3D overall in the film. If you saw it in IMAX or 4D or 4DX or whatever those new formats are, it was probably well worth the money. And this really brings up the debate about real D 3D versus the high frame rate 3D. Like I said before, I think the HFR 3D is pretty crap. It made the movie look like it was moving too fast. The last 3D movie I saw was one of the Hobbits, and the 3D in The Way of Water was much the same. It didn't feel like the quality standard was as high. Real D, in my opinion, was much better. Not all new technology makes things better. Sometimes it makes them worse. I don't think the 3D was universally bad all around the world. Maybe it was just my local cinema, and I can only speak for my experience. And I was thinking about seeing it again at a different cinema, but after what I paid at my theatre, which is pretty cheap, I didn't really want to spend upwards of $30 to go to the movies, especially a movie I've already seen. So back to the story of Avatar The Way of Water. Only issues is I wanted more of an intro. Being a movie this long, I was expecting more of a 20 to 30 minute intro and a catch-up of what has happened in the past 15 years or so. We're reunited with the RDA base. We get introduced to a couple of new and old familiar characters, one of which being Spider, the adopted human son of the Sully family. Dr. Max Patel and Norm Spellman make a return, as well as my personal favourite, Miles Quarch, played by Stephen Lang, and his trusty sidekick, Lyle Wainfleet. The timeline at first is a little confusing. There is no set timeline outlined in the film. The first few minutes give us a very brief outline of what has happened in the past decade or so. And this is what I was saying about a director's cut. Maybe if there is an extended version, we could have a more extended intro of 20 or 30 minutes or so. The only real way to track the timeline is Neytiri gets pregnant several times. The Sullys have multiple kids. There are 2 teenagers and a younger daughter, and the adopted Kiri, played by Sigourney Weaver. And of course, the feral human kid, Spider. When we first see Spider, he's a toddler in nappies running amok around the old lab. Sigourney Weaver's character, Kiri, has a lot of mystery surrounding her. She's found as a child avatar in a tank. She has an immaculate conception, which doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. There's a lot of religious undertones surrounding her. So this film gives fans a lot more questions than answers sometimes, especially about Dr. Grace Augustine and Kiri and the Immaculate Conception. So does this conception have something to do with Awa? There's also several religious and biblical undertones to the film, which are birth, death, and rebirth, reincarnation. There's some quite heavy Buddhist and Christian symbology, the spontaneous conception being one of them, birth, death, and rebirth being a fundamental Buddhist belief. There are a lot of themes in the film. The big ones are family, who's your daddy, and what does he do, protecting your family, nature, the returning theme of greed, human and animal relationships, protecting and respecting the oceans and the planet is a big one, as well as lots of environmental messages. They're pretty obvious and pretty similar to the first one. Even if the film doesn't directly address it, the audience can assume that about 15 years or so have passed since the events in the first film and The Way of Water. It's pretty much the same amount of time since the first film was released, give or take a couple of years. As I mentioned before, you're right in the action right from the get-go. With Sully's peaceful family life is destroyed by the return of a familiar enemy, the RDA. The humans are back, and that means trouble is soon to follow. The new general of the RDA, Nurse Jackie star Eddie Falco, is a very underdeveloped character, which is unfortunate because she's interesting, but she doesn't have much of an impact on the story, unlike Stephen Lang's Quach in the original. She's not as threatening. Quach is more or less the attack dog of the film, who picks up his mission where he left off in the original. There are a lot of new additions to the cast, including Kate Winslet, who wasn't very easy to spot. It took a while for me to work out who she played. Her voice is very different, and obviously she was 9 foot tall and blue. Cliff Curtis is great as always. One of the biggest standouts was the younger cast. They were great. Their performances were very impressive. Britton Dalton, Trinity Jolie Bliss, Jamie Flatters, Bailey Bass, June Evans Jr. are among a few of the characters who were outstanding. It wouldn't have been easy given their limited acting ability. So to perform in motion capture underwater would have been a very big ask from a younger, more inexperienced cast, but James Cameron pulled it off. Some of the older characters, such as CCH Pounder, I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, Joel David Moore, aren't really in it enough, which was a bit disappointing because I wanted a bit more from those characters. Brendan Cowell, the space whaler, he plays Scoresby, who is an absolute prick. Jamie Clement of Flight of the Conchords plays a spineless marine biologist. And that's one of the issues with the film, is the inconsistency of new characters being introduced. They come in various points in the film. Some are past the halfway mark, some come in early in the film and then are dropped and not mentioned again. But I get the length of the film probably had a large part to play in that. But one of the highlights were the recumbent Marines. The old RDA Marines from the first film come back as avatars, or Na'vi. They are cool as fuck. There's some scenes in the jungle when they find the shack and Quach crushes his own skull, which was very cool and very Shakespearean. The night shootout in the rain was pretty intense. So this sets up the next act in very efficient style. By this point, Quach has been set up to be the villain of the film after getting orders from the new general to stop the Na'vi insurgency. After gathering his memories, the old Quach sets his sights firmly on Jake Sully. He goes on a personal revenge mission to kill Sully, and he will do whatever it takes to complete the mission, even targeting Sully's kids to do so. Quach's journey is pretty extreme, like Jake's was in the first one. He is more ruthless than the first one. This time around, there are no rules. He's going to get the job done. Jake Sully, on the other hand, is a very different Jake. He's more mellow. He's a father. He's more interested in protecting his family than serving two masters and being the leader of this revolution, which was good. All the characters in this film have very realistic story arcs. This is pretty familiar ground for Cameron. There's a couple of interesting parallels between Quach and some of Cameron's other revenge-driven characters. I don't think he would have been out of place in a Terminator film. We could have called him the Q800. The Marines are now inhabiting avatar bodies. There's a line in the film, "We've been brought back in our enemies' bodies," which is the opposite to the first film, where the avatars were the good guys. Now it's The avatars are more or less the bad guys. They're not quite avatars because obviously their human form was killed off in the first film. They've come back in recumbent bodies as part of their insurance policy. Seeing Quatch plug into the Banshee and do the same thing Jake did in the first film was pretty cool. He has become Jake in a perverse opposite way. Another issue I had was the introduction of the new RDA base, Bridgehead City, where the underdone general resides. And this is where we're introduced to a subplot of the film about the Earth dying and needing to colonize Pandora for future plot points, I think. This isn't really elaborated on much further than that. The Earth is dying. Well, I assume it's probably from a climate catastrophe, and humans need a new home, more or less. After the first 35 to 45 minutes, the Sullys find themselves as refugees, headed for the sea to seek refuge with the Sea Peoples. I was a bit sad to see the jungles go. I wanted a bit more of the Pandoran jungles and the creatures that live in them from the first one. But now we enter this new, visually stunning ocean world of Pandora. The oceans of Pandora offer a new landscape to the world of Avatar. It expands the world and makes it bigger. In a way, the jungle was a little isolated. Now we're in this vast ocean that has unlimited plot possibilities. The Sullys find themselves living with the Sea People of the Barrier Reef. The new tribe is called the Metaina clan. It's very different from the vivid green and iridescent jungles and highlands of the floating mountains we have seen so far. We're transported to a blue and turquoise world where on the surface the water looks just like ordinary water. It looks like a normal ocean, which in itself is deceptive because all the water is visual effects. There wasn't any real water. And this is where the visually impressive part of the film really starts to kick in. It's a prime example of what special effects can do and should be used for to heighten storytelling, enhance it, and not act as a crutch like a lot of special effects heavy films do today. And just look at the decline in Marvel. They seem to have more special effects but less story. They seem to get more uninteresting the more they make. So over the next few hours, we get to know the Sea Peoples and are introduced to a new set of main characters, which unfortunately means we don't see some older favourites again, or it's a very long periods of time before we see them again. The new world is vibrant, the blues and turquoises are bold and bright, as are the new clans who are vastly different to what we've seen so far. It resembles a tropical paradise. The ocean brings with it the anticipation of all those beautiful underwater scenes we've been teased with during the trailers. So when the Sullys find their way to the Sea Peoples, the countdown is on to dive, pun intended, into Pandora's underwater world. We get our first taste of this when the Sully kids are given the rundown of how life works in the water, which we see through Kiri's connection with nature. The underwater scenes are some of the most impressive and vivid to be seen in a film pretty much ever. There's some really interesting camera angles where the camera is kind of bobbing half in and out of the water. When the kids dive into the ocean and they go under the waves, we're transported into an entirely new world, and it's hard to focus on one thing. On the one hand, you're watching Kiri swim in the water, but you're also trying to look at all the bright, vivid coloured Pandoran fish and sea creatures, and all this is popping out of the screen at you in 3D. But unfortunately, the 3D, in my experience anyway, lets the beauty of some of these scenes down. I was hoping that the 3D was going to pick up underwater, and that maybe the 3D was deliberately average till this point to heighten the experience when the film goes underwater. Some scenes, the fish are popping off of the screen. There are a couple of scenes where it's more noticeable. I guess I was expecting that you were going to feel like you were more in the water, that the 3D effect of the water was going to come out of the screen, making you feel like the waves were kind of in your face a bit more. Maybe my expectations were a bit too unrealistic. Like I said before, this may have been just a cinema I saw it at, and it probably was. However, the underwater bits could have really been a standout, and they are a standout in their own right. Unfortunately, in my experience, the 3D didn't really make much stand out. So the surface world is great too. It looks cool and colourful, but as soon as the kids dive into the water and go exploring. It's another living, breathing world, just as impressive in its own right as the jungles of Pandora. There is so much to look at, and it is very easy to get distracted and miss some of the subtitles in the film, which there are a few, and some of the plot points. In some cases, some of the subtitles stood out the most in 3D, so you couldn't really miss them. The ocean does give us a whole new lot of Pandoran animals, one of which was a highlight of the film, and that is the Pandoran space whales, also known as the Tolkien. The Tolkien are one of the biggest highlights of the film, and one Tolkien in particular steals the show. Jake's youngest son, Locke, or Loak, I can't remember how you say it, has his life saved by a Tolkien named Pyakon, who in turns needs a favour from Loak. Pyakon has been cast out from his group for breaking the law. The Medicaian clan and the Tolkien have a special bond, and they're more than just animals. They're a part of the clan and considered to be siblings of the Medicaian. The whales are highly intelligent and can communicate with the sea tribes. Very obvious messaging here about saving the whales. I personally wanted to join Sea Shepherd after watching the film or become a marine biologist. I also appreciate the ocean even more now. It also highlights the very delicate balance of the oceans. And personally, saving the whales is a cause close to my heart. I think we should be looking after the oceans. The second half of the film, the stakes are raised when Quach begins to terrorise and burn Sea Clan villages to draw out Jake. By this point in the story, there is no signs of the plot slowing down. On the one hand, this is good. It's a 3-hour plus movie, which means no time is wasted. We're getting straight into the action. On the flip side of that, we're not really getting the time to get to know some of the new characters or some of the locations. And there's a little bit of rushing in between some of the plot points. Quach teams up with probably the most vile and unlikable new character, and that is Scoresby. The space whaler now enter the new valuable resource/commodity the humans are willing to wipe out an entire species to get, and that is the space whale head oil. And this goes back to the days of whaling here on planet Earth, where sperm whales were hunted for their oil so people can burn it in lanterns. There's a lot of similarities here with Moby Dick, and it probably was one of the inspirations for this part of the story. There's also the very obvious evils of whaling, which still does happen today, and how humans' greed and the need for resources drive evil industries like whaling. Scoresby is the real villain. Quach is likable in a way. You can sympathise with him. You can get on his level. You understand he's gone after Jake because of revenge. Yeah, he comes from this military world where what he does and how he gets the job done is acceptable. Scoresby, on the other hand, is all about profit. He hunts whales for money because the oil can stop human aging, and one vial of oil is worth $80 million. And like the first film, The Way of Water has its own attack on the home tree. There is a very disturbing extended scene involving whaling that will make most people in the audience sick. It's hard to watch, and by the end of it you detest human beings even more. The whale is killed, the carcass is wasted, the whale's calf ends up dying in the process. They deliberately target the mother because she won't leave her calf. Quach leaves the carcass for Jake and the Medicaian to find. It's a very confronting scene. And I found the scenes involving the whales the most emotional in the film. The whales got to me and they made me cry several times. There is an issue with this new industry, and part of Pandora isn't very well explained, and there's no mention of the valuable commodity from the first film, unobtainium, which you would think you would need a lot of if you are to build a city on the planet. So this leads to the final act and the Battle of the Reef, which is impressive to say the least. I'm not going to give too much away. It's a pretty lengthy, drawn-out battle. It's visually impressive, and it makes you want to stand up, pump your fist in the air, and cheer for Jake and the whales. There's lots of sinking ships and emotional tones. Kids need to be saved, bad guys needed to be defeated, and there's a very brilliant setup for a much bigger world, which hopefully we get to see in future sequels. Final thoughts on the film. Running time wasn't as bad As I was expecting, some 3-hour films are tedious, while others feel like they're well paced and aren't so bad. James Cameron has a history of making very long epic films, and he's the master of it, so I don't know why I ever doubted it. The visual effects were outstanding. One of the main issues I had was the story. I don't think it was as strong a story compared to the first film. It's a little shallow in places. There was a lot going on in this film. There's a lot to take on board. There's a lot of characters that drop in and out of the story, and there was a lot to keep you preoccupied. There's nothing boring about this film. It doesn't get bogged down. However, there were many unanswered subplots. There are a few main subplots and a couple of subplots that are briefly mentioned. And a lot of characters drop in and out of the story at random points. I'm assuming some of the subplots will be continued in the third and fourth films, and some of the characters will return. There needed to be a little bit more explanation to the return of the RDA and the whalers and the humans like Patel and Norm, who stayed behind, as well as some of the Na'vi characters from the first film. The transitions are very quick in this film, and if you blink or stare too long at the creatures under the water, you might miss a valuable plot point. And that's another issue, is everything is so pretty and colourful, you just want to stop and stare at everything. The story is a little fragmented in places, and I do have a lot of lingering questions, which will hopefully be answered in the sequels. I do hope there is an even longer director's cut that will expand on some of these points. Overall, Avatar is definitely a cut above the standard, meaningless, contrived special effects blockbuster that Hollywood usually churn out month after month. The Way of Water has more depth and soul than a Marvel movie or sci-fi fantasy film that has been produced year in, year out. Avatar 2 has a very defined and strong message, as it's been described by James Cameron, the worst business case in movie history. This is an article of slashfilm.com. James Cameron calls Avatar: The Way of Water the worst business case in movie history. James Cameron remains one of the film industry's biggest technological inventors and a Titan-level director that is obsessed with pushing the medium to its limits. What makes him truly great as a popularist filmmaker is that he always knows how to properly sell a humane story that makes full sense of that ambiguous appetite for cutting-edge technological prowess. His career is long and critically acclaimed, but for my money there is no better embodiment of Cameron's wacky and imaginative vision than the future of cinema than his 2009 blockbuster Avatar. Whisking viewers away into the world of Pandora through IMAX 3D screens and the first blended live-action CG animation. It clearly stands the test of time, as this year's re-release box office numbers prove. This December, Cameron finally makes his return to the big screen, with a sequel that has been over a decade in the making, Avatar: The Way of Water. With a runtime that's over 3 hours long, the cinematic epic will bring audiences back into the world of Pandora and also measure interest for 3 other sequels that Cameron wishes to make and finalise his overarching story of humankind's relationship with the Na'vi people. Interestingly, even though Cameron is one of the most esteemed living filmmakers, his chances of finishing Avatar to his grand vision become more of a gamble than one would expect. This week, GQ profiled James Cameron and asked him about his return to the big screen and the long complex road to creating Avatar: The Way of Water, in which he describes his latest film as the worst business case in movie history. Production to The Way of Water began back in 2013. The perfectionist he is knew that Avatar's sequel would require starting everything from scratch. The title of the sequel is not just a flashy catchphrase. Water is a large part of the film's production and a huge motif of the story. Though Pandora is mainly portrayed in detailed CG animation, Cameron wanted to authentically mocap his actors' scenes underwater, returning to some concepts he established in The Abyss, with brand new context. The GQ profile runs through all the troubles Cameron had developing new AI systems and cameras needed to accomplish his vision. Nothing would work the first time Cameron and the production tried it, or the second, or usually the third. One day in Wellington, New Zealand, where Cameron was finishing the film, he showed me a single effect shot numbered 405. That means there's been 405 versions of this before it gets to me, he said. Cameron has been working on the movie since 2013 and it was due out years ago in September. He still wasn't done. Wow, that sounds tedious. The years of scrapped concepts and experimentations have inflated the budget of The Way of Water to an alarming degree. When asked how expensive his sequel budget was, Cameron coyly answered, "Very fucking." Going on to describe the film as the worst business case in movie history, Cameron claims the minimum goal of profitability for this Avatar sequel is at a drastic level. You have to be the third or fourth highest grossing film in history, he explained. That's your threshold, that's your break even. It might sound like Cameron's high ambition has put himself into an odd, difficult corner. Some fans have questioned the cultural impact of Avatar as time has distanced us from the original 2009 film, but this is not exactly the first time, nor will it be the last Cameron has been faced with seemingly impossible odds. As GQ points out, Cameron's previous successes, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, True Lies and Titanic, were all among the most expensive films ever made at the time of their release. Cameron went on to explain his mentality with those previous efforts. I used to be really defensive about expensive budgets, because it was always the first thing anybody would mention. And now I'm like, if I can make a business case to spend $1 billion on a movie, I will fucking do it. Do you want to know why? Because we don't put it all on a pile and light it on fire. We give it to people if the studios agree and think it's a good investment, as opposed to buying an oil lease off of the north of Scotland, which somebody would think was a good investment. Why not do it? The Maverick director is certainly right about that. Give Cameron an astronomical budget and he will make sure every dollar shows up on screen. He's the king of the box office for a reason. Even though his films present an extreme amount of financial risk, one cannot deny that the numbers have been there for him. Despite all the beats against him, James Cameron has turned a profit every single time. I also read somewhere that James Cameron said this was the most expensive advertisement for saving the whales ever made. Anyway, getting back to the film. Editing The Way of Water would have been a nightmare. I'll have to see it a few more times to really appreciate it, I think. I'm probably a little overly critical because I was so excited for the release of this movie and there was so much anticipation and hype about it. I think the expectations and the bar had been set so high, I don't think you can really properly absorb it on the first viewing. Avatar 2 is also very open-ended. There is a lot that has been left unresolved, and I think this has probably been by design. It's easy to forget it's part of a much bigger expanding story of the Sully family, Colonel Quach, the humans, and the world of Pandora. All the main characters go on their own dramatic journeys, which will carry over into the sequels, especially Quach and Jake. Jake is a far different character than the first Avatar, and after Act 1 of The Way of Water, he has a family. Family is the main theme of the film, and sometimes sticking together in that family has dramatic and unforeseen consequences. We'll all have to wait with anticipation to see what happens to the Sully family in the future sequels, and after all, James Cameron is the undisputed king of a sequel. Avatar 2 has also pushed the envelope of what is possible in filmmaking technically and physically. The special effects are out of this world. If you compare that with those heinous Ninja Turtle remakes they made a couple of years ago, I saw Out of the Shadows on TV recently, and the visual effects are from 2016, and they look fucking horrific. The visual effects in that have aged pretty badly, and that was only a couple of years ago, yet the first Avatar still holds up. And my point about the Ninja Turtle movies is that the filming for Avatar 2 began the year after in 2017. There was obviously a lot of challenges making The Way of Water, so we can assume that the technology developed to film in the water in 2017 was probably developed before 2017. I'm just making an educated guess, but that sounds right to me. It could have been developed in 2015, 2016, and whatever it was. The point being, the effects in Out of the Shadows were pretty bad. I'm not sure what the budget was on that. By the time we get the effects of The Way of Water, they're already a couple of years old. Compared to that with the first Avatar, which the effects still stand up today by today's standards. And this is a time where they're, every Marvel and Star Wars movies is pretty effects heavy, and it still looks better than a lot of its competition. Performance capture underwater would have been really hard. James Cameron had a custom-made water tank that was 120 feet long, 60 wide and 30 deep made to film some of the underwater scenes in, which would have presented a lot of challenges for the cast and crew, especially the cast that may have some aversions to working in water. I know that would have freaked me out. having to hold your breath underwater. Performance capture underwater would have been hard. I'll have to see the making of. Unfortunately, I think some of the special effect water scenes does create a bit of separation between the drama and the audience, unlike the Abyss or Titanic, where you can see real water flooding into a ship, and like in the Abyss where I can't remember her name, when she drowns, like you feel like she's really drowning. There's a very claustrophobic feeling to those films. Also, having to express emotions underwater would have been one of the most difficult things to achieve, and probably would have been the biggest challenge of a lot of the actors involved. You'd have to get very comfortable with water first. You'd have to learn to breathe and calm yourself and not panic, so you can keep your concentration and your emotions during the performances. There's also an underwater fight scene. I mean, there's been fight scenes underwater before, but not like this. This is much more intense. It has chokeholds and a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu underwater. Final thoughts on the film. James Cameron has said the sequels fit into a bigger story, but have their own conclusions. And this is a quote from John Landau, the producer. He has said the 4 sequels have an overarching meta-narrative that connects them to create a larger interconnected saga. James Cameron has said it's a fully encapsulated standalone plots that come to their own conclusions, a natural extension of all the themes and the characters and the spiritual undercurrents of the first Avatar. And with that quote, that brings us to the end of the show. A big thank you to everyone who made it to the end.
Imagination, creativity, storytelling, brainstorming, or Brianstorming. This is the Brianstorming Project. Join me, Chad, or as I probably should go by now, Brianstorm, each week as I use my overactive imagination to brainstorm ideas. Each week I'll pick a different genre and create a story from scratch. Characters, world, premise, the whole kit and caboodle. The creative process in podcast form. This should be fun. Listen to the Brianstorming Project wherever you get your podcast fix. Join the Brianstorm.
If you'd like to support the True Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram pages, give them a follow and a like for all the latest updates with the show. If you feel so inclined, please leave a review on the show. It helps it get found. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Google, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell people you work with or anyone else you think might like the show. Help spread the word and get the show found. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another show. But until then, I'm a tank. This is the truth. May the truth be with you.
Sci-fi.